Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Jodie Siganto. Jodie is one of Australia's leading privacy experts sought by government departments, international corporations and Australian businesses to advise on privacy and data security related matters. Over her career, she's held in-house roles with Unisys Asia and Dell. She's also co-founded data security firm Bridgepoint Communications, which was sold to Telstra in 2014, and held leadership roles with industry groups including AISA. Completing her doctorate on privacy and information security practice in 2014 at QUT, Jodie has focused on the last 5 years on privacy and security consulting and training, establishing legal and consulting firm Privacy 108 Consulting. Jodie has been involved with a range of privacy and security industry groups, including being the chair of the AISA Policy Committee and AISA Education Director. Following her lead role in researching the cybersecurity skills shortage on behalf of AISA, Jodie has continued to track skills issues in both the privacy and security professions. Jodie, it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks so much, Claire. Thanks for inviting me. And can I just take the opportunity to say thank you for your podcast. It's been fantastic for not just me personally, but I'm sure lots of other people in the industry to have access to the kind of people that you talk to, but also just the conversations that you're having. There's just such great conversations around really important issues in the information security space.
Oh, thank you. That's really great feedback and I really appreciate your generous words. It really helps, I guess, to always hear good feedback about the conversations that we're having. And I invited you onto the podcast to talk about the privacy industry and some of the skills challenges that industry might be facing. But before we get to that, you've had a long and varied career in information security and law. So tell us a bit about that, your background, the Training Institute. Tell us about the last few years in your career.
I got into information security in the early 2000s, I guess. I try to stop putting dates on these things because it just makes people, understand how old I am. Sometimes I look at people and they're going like, oh, I wasn't born then. Oh. So I was a lawyer. I guess I worked at IT companies, as you said, Tandem, Unisys, Dell, and was really interested, I guess, in the practical part of business rather than the legal stuff, which is kind of insight you get when you're in-house. But then decided to kind of have a crack at business myself in the year 2000. So with my brother Rob and Mike Tappington, we set up Bridgepoint. At that stage, it was going to be doing data networking, and I didn't know much about data networking, but knew a bit about running a business. And kind of quickly we realised that in the data networking space that security was going to become an issue. It's kind of strange now to look back on those times and think that security wasn't really on people's roadmap in a big way, but I guess that's kind of just what's happened in the journey over the last 19 years or so. So I kind of quickly, I guess, got into security more from the management policy information security management system, ISO 27001 perspective. We got Bridgepoint certified to ISO 27001 in 2003. So from there, kind of built that part of the security practice. We built a security team, I guess, so that ended up being one of the kind of key strengths of Bridgepoint was its security expertise. And so I continued sort of doing that until I left Bridgepoint in about 2010, 2011. But one of the other things that I did while I was there was kind of get into training. There were a lot of people who were looking at understanding more about security. So we, used some of our consulting team to deliver training courses, and we hosted the first CISSP exam that was in Queensland. We did that in 2003. As part of this kind of idea that it was important to build kind of skills, a more skilled cohort of people. And so from then on, I guess Bridgepoint kind of had a pretty good close connection with ISC Squared and some other training providers around the traps. And we, I guess, continued to sort of, operate in that space, just feeling, I guess, a bit of a sense of the importance of working together to kind of build skills and the capability and capacity of people in our neighbourhood at the time. So, I guess that's my really, really canned version of my information security journey from lawyer to information security consultant, and now more in the privacy space, I guess. And 2010, I decided to go back and do some study, which was a fantastic opportunity for me. But one of the things I was interested in was why information security wasn't being done better by organisations. Like, a lot of organisations seem to not sort of really be doing anything too differently or investing too much in information security. And I was interested in looking at it from a legal regulatory point of view. So I did a PhD and ended up doing it in kind of privacy, because that's really the only generally applicable law around information security, that APP, now APP 11, that you have to take reasonable steps to secure your personal data. So I had a look at the way the Privacy Commissioner had investigated data breach cases up to that point, the way that might have acted to kind of promote better information security practices. So kind of from doing that, I ended up getting more into the privacy space, which is where I've been sort of since about 2014.
So the opportunity for you to be in connection with a lot of cybersecurity leaders and privacy leaders as well, what's been your experience working with these types of people, and have you found that they tend to have sort of similar types of traits or similar things that are drawing them into the industry?
From my security consulting days, which is kind of, a little bit old now, I feel like a lot of the time we weren't necessarily dealing with leaders. They were more kind of middle management type people rather than kind of real leaders. They tended to be reporting into a CIO or at some piece down the chain a little bit. But the leaders that I did come across, I think there still seemed to be quite a variety of different types of leaders, and it perhaps is dependent on the particular organisation that they're part of, that idea of having kind of the right cultural fit. So, interestingly, I think you can sort of still see some of those really old-style autocratic, this is the way it's going to be kind of people in some organisations that still seems to work. But in most organisations now, I think that the security team leader is really the successful ones, embrace all those ideas of being good communicators and being able to kind of lead and manage a team. They support diversity. They understand the difficulties, but the importance of managing change, of embedding and looking at the kind of behaviours that need to change and really working on that. So I guess they're the ones who tend to be more successful. But yeah, I'm not sure. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about your podcast, is that you've been really good at kind of trying to tease out these differences of the different ways that teams are structured, the different skills and capabilities that you need at different time on your journey, or the different type of organisation you are.
I think it's a really important point that you need different types of skills at different times and along the journey. And I struggle a bit with whether or not organisations know where they are on the journey and therefore know what types of skills they need. And I think that leads us to this so-called crisis that people believe that we're having, that, what people are going out to market looking for isn't matching the leaders that are out in the market in terms of, candidate to organisation. And I know you did some research on this a few years back around this skills crisis. And for you, what were the key takeaways back then when you did the research? And do you feel like some of that remains unchanged now?
The starting point was to try and work out if there was a cybersecurity skills shortage and what it might look like in Australia, because most of the data that was available was really around American issues, and they came from organisations like AISA that has a little bit, in my view, of vested interest as a training organisation and promoter of certifications in talking about there being, a cybersecurity skills shortage. So just was sort of interested in, before, as an industry group, you started pursuing solutions, understanding a little bit more about what the problem was. So that was kind of the background for why AISA decided to do the research. And as I said, we looked at member survey plus job ads. And in 2016, looking at the number of advertised positions that were sort of were kind of the principal focus of the position was cybersecurity or information security. So obviously there are lots of positions where it might be part of your role, but this was looking where it was kind of the primary purpose of the role was going to be cybersecurity. There were probably like about 85 advertised positions in 2016, which is not a huge number of advertised jobs, to be honest. And the data sort of suggested that there wasn't kind of a big spike in salaries, that the salaries that were being offered were kind of about what you'd expect from middle management type role, which was what like most of them were. So, some of the traditional indicators of a skills shortage, which was that kind of like a high turnover, a high churn rate, big increase in salaries, wasn't present in 2016 when we were looking at the data. So looking at the job ads and then looking at what the survey respondents said, like they kind of, interestingly, and I just pulled it out again to have a look, but 78% of AISA members said, yes, there was a skills shortage, but only 16% were very concerned about it. Like 70% of people were kind of quite concerned, but kind of not really concerned. And some people even said things like, gee, we hope there is a skills shortage because it just means I'm always going to be able to get a job. So maybe that kind of self-interest meant that people weren't particularly concerned about it. But the lack of concern about it for me kind of was an indicator as well that people kind of thought, well, everyone says that there is, so there probably is, but it's not kind of going to have a big impact on me. And then when we asked people about, have you had a salary increase? Have you changed your job recently? Do you think your team is going to expand? The answers to all those questions was kind of no. So, as I said, those traditional indicators weren't there. But, once you sort of started to pick it apart, it kind of got like more interesting. It was, what was the biggest reason for you thinking there's a skills shortage? And the answer was management lack of understanding of our requirements. So it kind of turned out that we thought that maybe the issue was more about people not being able to get the skills that they thought that they needed as part of a general understanding of what their, the security capability of the organisation should be, rather than a lack of appropriately qualified candidates for available jobs. And I think that became kind of even clearer when you looked at the sectors where there was skills shortages. So the biggest employers which we could get from the job ads to, the organisations that were advertising were consulting firms, financial service providers and federal government. But when we asked our members where they thought the biggest shortages were, it wasn't actually in any of those organisations who were the people who were employing information security people. It was in the places that actually weren't employing them. So health service providers, not-for-profits, state and local government. So it was kind of, that was kind of interesting. And when you looked at that, it kind of maybe put into stark relief again this idea that the problem was more around employer lack of understanding of the kind of the key requirement, as well as also some kind of suggestion that salary caps and the way that roles have been created in governments meant that they weren't able to appropriately recruit for the kind of skills that they needed because of the band where these different places sit. So there was lots of feedback from members, which is that it's inability to kind of appropriately fund it rather than a lack of skills. So. And other really interesting stuff, most of the jobs are in Melbourne and Sydney. There are no regional jobs. There were no entry-level jobs. Even where there was something that was set as an entry-level job, they still said that you needed to have a CISSP that you can't get without 5 years, experience. So, lots of those kind of barriers of entry. And the other one that I thought was really interesting was that lack of consistency in description of job roles and what that meant for people who were looking to get a job in information security, and the fact that an analyst might be anything from somebody working in a SOC to somebody who was looking at pulling apart vulnerabilities and stuff, that there was just no kind of consistency about what that might be, made it very difficult for people to work out what skills they might need and what their pathway might be into information security.
I think that there is certainly an appetite to try to streamline or standardise some of these roles against the titles, because there are a lot of different titles out there. There are specialists, there are analysts, there are architects, and lots of people think different things about different titles. And there's definitely an appetite to standardise, but whether or not that's actually going to happen and who can do that is, I guess, another question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean that's another thing that was interesting from my point of view about Australia, that if you look at the UK and United States, the government's been a lot more involved there in setting up skills frameworks, whether it's the NICE one in the US or the UK one, that they and that kind of linked back to the really strong, I think, involvement of both kind of governments in the UK and the US in the information security kind of space, recognising the importance of their role as an employer and almost as kind of a training ground for people in information security, with the idea that, you kind of go into these big like the Department of Homeland Security or the NSA or somewhere in the United States, and you do a couple of years and then you go out and you go into industry, but you've got like a really good solid grounding in information security. And as I said, I haven't been close to it for the last couple of years, but Australia just didn't have that same appetite, and whether it was because of the more distributed nature of our government departments between the federal, state and local governments, and the defence capacity or the cybersecurity capacity was across different departments, which now at least have all been brought into one. But historically, I'm not sure that that's been to Australia's advantage, because it hasn't been the hand of government working to kind of develop a skills framework or accepted roles or other things I think have been quite effective.
If we shift a little bit of our thinking towards some of your more recent work in privacy, what's going on in the privacy industry from a resourcing and recruiting perspective?
So that was what was really interesting to me, because privacy, I think, is definitely going through a huge shift, and it reminds me of the early days of security in lots of ways, because particularly in Australia, organisations are moving from a situation where they had a privacy policy that they probably nicked from somebody else, plus maybe some person who was supposed to be the privacy officer, but they probably didn't even know that was their role, to now understanding that there's much broader obligations to understand the kind of personal data that they collect and how it's collected, the purpose of it being collected, who they share it with, all that kind of stuff, which makes it a much more kind of robust type system that you need in place. So there's this kind of, I think a big movement going from that, from almost a zero starting point in lots of cases to, requiring quite significant sort of skills. So I think, like in security, the banks are a bit ahead of us, where they've kind of been working on developing, significant teams over time. But I think that the rest of the ecosystem is catching up with them, whether it's, it's kind of, it touches every part of our business, the whole, all the issues around the way that you collect, handle and secure personal data. So I'm seeing that shift out of it being a legal kind of problem into it being a more of a business problem, and people trying to work out, well, what's the best way for us to kind of meet that problem.
We often hear people in the cybersecurity industry say, oh, I fell into cyber, or this just became part of my role. And I guess that, some people weren't really looking for cyber and it found them. Do you find that's the case in privacy, that staff are plucked out from other areas of the business and given the privacy flag to fly?
Oh, definitely. Oh, goodness. And it's so fascinating. I see kind of a couple of things. I think the most common model at the moment, as I said, is that privacy has been a legal obligation, and the legal department, now that it's getting overrun with requirements to review data processing agreements, to do vendor privacy assessments, to do legitimate interest assessments, to put together a privacy data inventory. Like, they're kind of throwing their hands up and saying, no, we can't do this. This isn't legal. It's somebody else. Having a look, so I've started doing the same kind of tracking of job ads in privacy as we did for security, and at the moment privacy is kind of sitting in either legal, moving out of legal more into kind of compliance risk, and there's also some organisations where privacy is sitting in security, and that's kind of really fascinating to me, without getting kind of too esoteric about it. One of the things about privacy is that it has its basis in the European sense of privacy, and this idea of it being a fundamental human right. So it has this idea of it being a kind of a fundamental value that should be protected as part of us being kind of, the individual self-determinant sort of citizens that part of like modern liberal democracies, which is a little bit different to the US view of privacy, which stems more from their legislative environment, being that privacy is around data breach and preventing against data breach. So you kind of can sort of see a very interesting dynamic with these two kind of culturally opposed views of what privacy is, with Australia kind of sitting in the middle with a EU type regulatory environment where our Privacy Act is based on this premise that privacy is essential to the functioning of liberal democracies, and us as individuals Whereas I'm not quite sure that culturally Australians necessarily accept that, but it certainly comes kind of head to head with the American idea that privacy is really about preventing data breach, and to some extent, if it's got any other kind of fundamental benefit, it's that privacy should protect you from government surveillance. So just tracing that through. And again, it's a little bit esoteric, but one of the things that we did when we were at AISA was that we interviewed information security practitioners to kind of get a sense of what information security people actually do, because it's one of those things a bit like the cybersecurity skills shortage, where people talk about it and talk about information security skills, but there hasn't really been that much research done into what is the everyday life of an information security practitioner. And when we went and talked to them, and we only interviewed about 12 people, but I have had lots of conversations with information security practitioners since then, and you ask them questions about, what do you think is information security? What's the kind of the reason for what you do? Most people would say something like, we know that the answer should be protecting the confidentiality, integrity and availability of information, but it's really something else. It's not really that, it's something else. And most people, to the extent that they could articulate what they thought the purpose of information security was this idea of it kind of doing the right thing, like that it was an important thing to do for our society, but it was very difficult for that to be articulated. And I think one of the things that's kind of missing from security that is kind of there in privacy is this idea of what the underlying value of it is. And I do personally think that information security has got a huge public good. Without it, we would have, if you think about, the absence of it now at a societal level, it will be enormously harmful.
It sounds like the value of privacy and of having someone in that role is much more clearly defined from what you're saying. And so in comparison, we've talked about the cybersecurity roles being less defined and even to the titles being less defined. Do we think that privacy are having a skill shortage as well, given that we know what the privacy officer is there to do and it's much more clear based on the regulation and based on the role they need to play to protect information and protect our customers or members or whoever the identities are? Is there a skills crisis? So do we need more people in this space or do we know who we need and they're definitely out there?
I'm genuinely kind of sceptical of there being a cybersecurity skills shortage. I think it's much more nuanced than that. I think, it needs to be kind of seriously unpicked. I think that there are lots of issues that kind of end up not being investigated by just taking a broad brush. Yes, we've got a cybersecurity skills shortage. However, I actually think that there is a privacy skills shortage because of that kind of, we're starting almost from point zero and having to gear organisations up to design and implement a really robust privacy management framework that's not dissimilar to what we do with information security. And it's not something, again, that can be done either by lawyers or by compliance people or by technology. Just as in information security, you need to bring that kind of cross-organisational skill set together and get everybody to kind of work together to design and implement a management system that's going to involve significant organisational change. So, yes, I think that there is a skill shortage. I don't think many organisations in Australia certainly have thought about this too much. I think Europe is amazingly ahead of us. I think that this is just the start of what's going to be a significant ongoing thing. It's not a let's just build a program and it'll be okay kind of stuff. It's not a just let's get the skills to get it done. It's an ongoing thing because most organisations in Australia operate internationally and there's significant international developments going on all the time. And because of this kind of different focus, the California Consumer Protection Act is all about protecting data from being sold to third parties or marketing organisations, which is a completely different animal to the GDPR, which is kind of based on this kind of protection of fundamental human rights. So kind of looking through these different lenses, that are not necessarily aligned, requires lots of skills, and it's changing all the time. Russia and China, Vietnam, they're taking a very protectionist view. They're using data protection as a way of preventing data being transferred outside of their jurisdiction. So
if we think about it from a training perspective, if I guess your experience has been both on the privacy side and the security side, and we think about the leaders who are leading these security professionals and privacy professionals, what advice would you have for them around upskilling their staff? Is there a particular course they should do or a pathway that you would recommend that I guess would give them some fundamental knowledge in this space?
Again, just going back to like looking at the privacy job ads, is almost identically to information security, almost all the advertised positions. And there are probably, like over the year that we've been tracking it, the number of job ads for privacy have gone from 25 to 30. So not the kind of huge leap that I would expect. All of those job ads require experience. Some of them require 2 to 3 years. Some of them require 8, 10, 12 years. And it's, I think, an unreasonable expectation given the handful of people who have privacy experience in Australia that's going to be met. So talking to people who are recruiting, and I talk to a lot of privacy people who are recruiting, and they can't find people. Most people will use their network. So they'll use people that they've worked with. Lots of people will come from regulators, banks, telcos who have the biggest teams. They are kind of regularly poaching each other's staff, and everybody's kind of going around in big circles at the moment. Good people aren't staying long in particular jobs. So, that whole kind of 12-month cycle, and then they move on. And so I just think it would be really good if we could just kind of take a little bit of a step back and have a look at what's going on and learn from some of the lessons that we should have learned from the information security space. We have the same issues with lack of clarity of job roles. We have the same issues with there not being a clear career path. We have the same issues with there not being appropriate kind of education to skill up different people for different roles, right? One of the things that kind of disappointed me about AISA was that was kind of part of the work that was going to get done that's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, is kind of as an industry group trying to work on developing those things. If the government isn't going to be present in that space, then employers kind of aren't necessarily going to come together. So it's kind of, in my view, it's a role of industry group. Again, in Australia, I suspect it might be something where an industry group needs to come together to kind of drive that kind of need and change, and it would be really good to see that happen.
Jodie, we've covered heaps today. How can people connect further with you, or know more about your training, or hear more that you've got to say?
Oh, gosh, if anybody is interested in listening to any more of my rants, they can certainly contact me. I'm the only Jodie Siganto around, so I always use myself as an example of, is a name personal information? Yes, mine is, because I'm the only Jodie Siganto, but just setting up a new privacy consulting organisation called Privacy 108. So that website will be up in the next month or so, but I'm on LinkedIn in the meantime. So, and love to have a chat.
Well, thank you for sharing today. I think you've covered a topic that a lot of people probably weren't aware of around this shortage of skills in privacy. So I'm really grateful for your time and to take time out of your day for me and the audience. So thanks again. That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.